Hello and welcome to the First Right Podcast, your weekly dose of conservative news brought to you by Restoration of America. I'm your host, Hayden Ludwig, Research Director for Restoration News. You can find our work at restoration-news.com. Today we're joined by Christian Toto, a leading conservative voice in Hollywood, here to talk about the liberal bias in Tinseltown and how conservatives can win the culture war. Christian, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
So I grew up in California, and I can tell you from experience that, of course, it is a one-party cult-like state. I mean, I like to joke that being gay, openly gay in the 1940s was a much easier thing than being openly conservative in Hollywood today. Mm-hmm. You call yourself the accidental culture warrior. You waded in, but you seem like a happy warrior to me from everything I've seen and read from you. Tell us your story and your experience about being openly conservative in Hollywood.
Yeah, I got into the business because I was a failed art major and I just wanted to review movies. I love film. And then along the way, first of all, 9/11 happened and changed my political trajectory. And then the more I realized being as a film critic is that most of my peers judged films from a left-leaning perspective. There's no crime in that, but it's just the preponderance of people doing the work that I did leaned in that direction. It became more and more obvious. And I think they were more and more open about it and not really trying to even balance out their views. So at some point earlier in my career, I thought, I should lean into this. I am right of center. This is who I am. It's organic to me. And I think half the country needs someone to review films from my perspective, from their perspective. And that's been my career up until now. And so far, so good. And I've been treated well within Hollywood as far as getting access to films and actors and screenwriters, things like that. But it has become more complicated in recent years as Hollywood has been more aggressively political and also more less willing to defend free speech. I think it's been one of the biggest bugaboos I've had for quite the last few years now is that, I may disagree with Hollywood actors, the product that comes out of the system, but you'd think we'd all be on the same page when it comes to free speech, and we're not. And that's been the toughest pill to swallow in recent months and certainly years.
Well, we've known since the 1930s and Leni Riefenstahl that film is a powerful propaganda tool. It can shape the minds and the ideas of millions of people. This has very obviously been in the case in Hollywood since, I would say, at least the 1950s, maybe the 1940s. In your book, Virtue Bombs, you talk a lot about how the most recent descent, not only from being openly, or mindlessly liberal, I guess I would say, in the 1990s, the way we remember it, when we were much younger, but this descent into woke hell, into this identity politics as everything has to be forced into every message. How did that happen? Chart out that process for us.
Well, I think it's a reflection of the culture at large. You're seeing it happening on universities and corporate America. I think Hollywood was only all too eager to take up those cues. I will say since the book has come out, I think there's been a bit of a shift back a little bit to the middle where the messaging isn't as profound, isn't as direct, isn't as commonplace. But yeah, it's just what was happening in the culture bled directly into the films that we see and the TV shows we watch. And I think comedy has been one of the more interesting battlegrounds in this arena because I think there's been a real fight there behind the scenes and sometimes in front of the scenes. And I think there's been some success on that front as well, which is certainly heartening to me. Who doesn't love comedy? But I also think that comedians are on the front lines of this free speech wars. Just have to go back to the Lenny Bruce days and George Carlin and what they endured. So yeah, it's been fascinating to watch. It's hard to say this caused that. I think sometimes the culture moves in its own unique directions, but it's what happens in academia doesn't stay in academia. That's part of the explanation.
Yeah, well, speaking of comedy, the modern woke left has about as much of a sense of humor as the Stasi, right? And it used to be that liberals were really funny. If you go back to the classic SNL skits in New York, they're hilarious, and they're not afraid to attack both sides. But you look at, say, for instance, the Trump skits that they put on from 2016 on, they're just really not that clever or funny. In fact, it's become more people who are libertarian or right of center who have really kind of blossomed into, well, the culture warrior who is funny telling jokes and great with the memes and everything. How did that happen? The left created this vacuum, obviously, but where did conservatives learn to become so funny in response?
Well, I think it's a response to the culture. It's a response to a marketplace where certain ideas are not being shared, certain jokes are not being told. It just opens up this chasm that people on the right have been able to jump into. Listen, conservatives are funny, liberals are funny. There's no real demarcation there, but it's just that one side is so unwilling to tell certain jokes and unwilling to go in certain directions. And the other side just looks around and says, "Hey, I think we can. I think we should. I think that's what you're supposed to do." So that's been sort of the overall thrust of things, and it's just it's a huge opportunity. And look at the Babylon Bee and look at the Onion. I grew up reading the Onion, very funny, very irreverent, mocking headlines, creating narratives. It was the gold standard for the kind of fake news comedy. And now you read it, they avoid certain jokes. They can't really poke fun at Democrats like they could or should. And you could just tell it's a hamstrung. And sometimes it's just cruel. And then look at the Babylon Bee, which will poke fun at Trump in a very funny way from time to time. But also, they're looking at a target-rich environment. They think, oh my gosh, that's ridiculous. That's absurd. We can joke about it. And so some of the humor is just hilarious. And I would like to think that our liberal friends would find humor in it as well, because it is universal. And, the whole thing about satire is it needs to have a kernel of truth to be funny. And I think that the Babylon Bee does a great job of that, along with people like Tim Dillon, Ryan Long, Tyler Fisher, other comedians who are just breaking the mold and finding great success.
Yeah, that's right. And I think a big part of this too is that we live in a clown world, right? We have people who are fundamentally unserious.
Mhm.
They're very serious about what they want to do, but they're kind of like the KGB officer with way too many medals on his jacket, right?
Mhm.
It's kind of fun. It's easy to make fun of. It is a target-rich environment, and it's unfortunate that so many political liberals feel like the only place they can be accepted, I think, for comedy is among right-wing circles. There, what a strange phenomenon! I never would have guessed would have happened 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to watch people like John Cleese and Ricky Gervais and Dave Chappelle and Rob Schneider. None of them are really conservative in any traditional sense, and many are still not. Maybe Rob is maybe middle of the road, maybe leaning right now, but they understand the stakes. They understand what's going on. This is their culture. This is their life. This is their work. This is their field, and they see it being taken over by these scolds who don't want to make us laugh, or you can't laugh at this, or you've got to, certain jokes have to come out a certain way. I mean, we've seen comedians like Will Ferrell and Jonah Hill say, "Yeah, I'm so sorry I did those jokes. I wouldn't do them today." I mean, apologizing for jokes that made us laugh and made us think, and it took us out of our troubles. I mean, that's a wonderful thing. They shouldn't apologize for it. And listen, the culture does change in a way. I think you could always point back to movies like 16 Candles with Long Duck Dong, the very stereotypical Asian character. I don't think we do that today. I think we're mostly, if not completely, fine with that. It was not, it was clunky. It just wasn't cool. So I do think there is an evolution of culture, but also, when we take certain topics off the table, it's just, we feel hamstrung. We can't go there. And often comedy will bring us together. And I've heard many cases where people of certain minority groups will say, yeah, make fun of us. I mean, we want to be part of the community. Don't put us in a glass box and say, do not touch. We're silly and crazy and weird and wonderful and human like everyone else. And why would we need to be treated with kid gloves? We don't, I don't think we want that. So, and I think a lot of comedians find that when they go to the clubs and they reach out to the audience and they poke fun here and there, often what they get back is laughter.
Yeah, it's actually a sign of acceptance,
Mhm.
not bigotry or hatred to poke fun at somebody. It's you don't do that to somebody you despise, right? You don't do it in good humor.
Yeah.
One of the interesting phenomena of our time is this rise in, much more serious topic, but these conservative biopics. I think of Dinesh D'Souza, for instance, who on cue always every presidential election has a massive new documentaries coming out with. That's a new phenomena. Recently, you reviewed Reagan, for instance,
Mhm.
which I've yet to see it, but I understand it's an excellent movie. You reviewed it very well, and it's a very rah-rah movie. A little sappy, I've heard, but in a very positive way. If Americans want to remember a time that was genuinely happier, when we were not quite so divided and didn't hate each other like we seem to do today. Where did that get started? Is that Dinesh D'Souza? Is it other people doing it? What's the history there?
Well, I think people on the right are realizing that they can't infiltrate the system. And, I cover Hollywood, so it's Hollywood. So if you want to make a movie that's about Reagan, that's more positive than negative, you really can't go through the traditional channels. So it has to be made outside the system. But what's happening now with technology and different distribution channels and YouTube is that you can create these projects and products and reach an audience and do it at a smaller budget, a smaller price point, and find success. So listen, not every project is successful. Some projects are clunky. I mean, this is an emerging art form on the right where, the left has had decades and decades of nurturing and money and experience to make great art, and they often do. But people on the right, they're some of them are new to this. Dinesh D'Souza was a pundit and an author, and now he's got 6, 7, 8 movies. I've lost track, and they get better. They look better. They're more sophisticated. I look at faith-based films. At first, they were clunky, and the acting was awkward, and the scripts were really rudimentary. And now they're pretty good. Often, the skill has improved. So, you got to get some swings at the plate before you get better. And I think that's what you're seeing in this marketplace. So I think there's an opportunity. I think there are technological advantages, and I think people are just realizing that, hey, half the country wants to be entertained. They might want to see a movie like Am I Racist, or Vindicating Trump, or God's Not Dead. There's a marketplace for it. I mean, there's a marketplace for content from the left. That's perfectly fine. But most people on the right have been shut out of Hollywood. It's one of the topics I cover the most aggressively, the new Hollywood blacklist. And I feel like I'm almost alone in doing so. And the fact that the mainstream media hasn't really picked up this fight shocks me, because I don't care if you despise conservative values. Conservatives have every right to speak and share their thoughts. And the fact that they can't within the Hollywood, inner sanctum, with some exceptions, John Voight is certainly grandfathered in. It's shocking. It's truly shocking. And I can't stop talking about it because the problem is consequential. And of course, it isn't just even isolated to Hollywood. It's happening across the culture. You say the wrong thing at your job, maybe you're fired or canceled or punished. And if someone said much worse from a left-leaning perspective, they may be fine.
And it does seem that in the economy and in Hollywood, instead of trying to force their way back into the system that's blacklisting them, you do see the rise of this parallel universe, right? We have our own Amazon, we have our own, our own Hollywood, everything like that. Do you think, this is speculation, but do you think there's a future for that where there's basically going to be two versions of these things, or do eventually they kind of mold back together after the culture war resolves itself?
I mean, in my optimistic view, they merge at some point, and it just becomes the system where you've got stories for the left, you got stories for the right, stories aimed at the heartland, stories aimed at everyone. That's the perfect situation. I don't think we're there yet. I think this parallel economy situation is by necessity. And at the end of the day, I think that, and I talk mostly Hollywood because it's what I know. They're leaving money on the table. I mean, you look at late night TV; it's aggressively left of center. There's no debate about that. And then for years and years, it was exactly the same. And no one raised their hand in a studio and said, if you put a Dennis Miller type or someone like that on a show and let him run free, you got half the country that might be eager to see it. Like, either the thought doesn't cross their mind, or it does, and they say, we don't want that. So it took Fox News to come along, give Greg Gutfeld, a show, and now he's killing it in the late night landscape. But there wasn't even an appetite for it. There's no one even going there or suggesting it. I spoke to a comedian, Michael Loftus, who said he pitched a show that was maybe either right-leaning or even maybe center-based. And the reaction he got is, yeah, it's a good pitch, but we're not doing that. We just don't want to be seen in that direction. So it's real. And if you're not going to do it, someone else will. And you look at the big comedians these days, it's not Stephen Colbert, it's Tim Dillon, it's Shane Gillis, it's Joe Rogan. And I think it's the comedians who don't play by the rules who are drawing massive following. Matt Rife comes to mind. Tony Hinchcliffe from Kill Tony. I mean, that show sounds like Howard Stern 30 years ago. He's becoming huge, and he's completely outside the mainstream.
And what you find, another part of the theme here is, especially with a guy like Joe Rogan, right? He may not be politically conservative or share a lot of conservatives' views on much of anything, but he's open to their messaging. He's open to their ideas. So it feels refreshing, like, wow, we can have a conversation that I remember happening 30 years ago between right and left, or right and middle, or whatever, that you cannot have in most of the existing institutions that have been captured by these woke skulls, as you call them. That is an amazing part of what's going on right now.
It is. There's almost like a free-thinking subclass rising up. You've got Dr. Drew Pinsky, Ghislaine Michaels, Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan looks at the landscape and says, that Riley Gaines, the swimmer who lost out on first place trophy because a trans swimmer beat her, that's a story. She might have something interesting to share. So she comes on his show. and he might have Alex Jones. And I am not an Alex Jones fan at all, but he's open to talking to him. Not my first, second,
Sure.
or 15th choice, but there it is. He just wants to have conversations. And what's wrong with conversations? And I can listen to Alex Jones and say, not my cup of tea. I don't like him. I don't like his approach. I don't agree with him, but I don't want him banned. I don't want him deplatformed. But that's where this all began, when we kicked off Alex Jones of all the suitable platforms, because it wasn't just going to be Alex.
That's
It was going to be
right.
other people too. And we saw that with the Twitter files a couple of years ago.
Well, it's narrowing the acceptable field
Mm-hmm.
of political views and cultural views that you can have. And, what happened to the idea in this country that free speech means that a guy like Jones can go on to a national podcast like that. And if his ideas are really as crazy, then people will walk away and say, I don't believe
Yeah.
that. But the idea that they're too dangerous to be heard, now that is a new concept that the woke left has pushed.
Yeah, I mean, we saw that with COVID. I mean, certain ideas, certain principles, certain theories were just beyond the pale, and they were destructive. But often they turn out to be right, and often the things that we're told to
Yeah.
say and to do were wrong, just flat out wrong. I mean, that should have been the test case for why free speech is so necessary. But I'm scared to death about free speech as we stand. You were kind to frame me as a happy warrior, and I think I mostly am, but boy, reality is catching up to me, and it is getting scary out there. And when you see major tech platforms under fire, when you see Elon Musk, oh, we should arrest him. What's his crime? Letting more people speak and not less.
That's
I mean,
right.
my gosh, listen, there are arguments to be made about what content is available on a platform like X or Twitter. You don't want people pushing violence in an extreme way. I mean, there's certain ramifications or certain guardrails that should be in place, or at least we should talk about them. But I just look around at Hollywood, and they care more about a crazy cat lady quip from a vice presidential candidate than genuine, legitimate attacks on art. I mean, a few months ago, we learned that Ian Fleming and Agatha Christie and Roald Dahl, their works were being tweaked and censored and made better by sensitivity readers. I mean, that's an outrage. That should be on the lips of every actor who makes art for a living, and they just can't spare a syllable about it. But, when it comes to some silly meme or some nonsense, or, Trump wasn't really hit by a bullet, it was something else, as Rosie O'Donnell opined recently.
Yeah.
I mean, listen,
A shard of glass.
with your craziness, it's fine. You can't spare any oxygen for the other stuff. Seems pretty important to me. It's your livelihood.
What role?
It's your lifeblood.
What role do you think China has played in this? Or I guess to ask the question differently, how concerned are you about how Hollywood does seem to be strongly catering to the censors in the Chinese Communist Party in order to, I mean, we get it. It's a huge billion-person market over there. We understand wanting to sell movie tickets over there, but changing movie scripts, taking scenes out, this seems like where it might start, right?
Yeah, it's a complicated question because that was what was happening a couple of years ago. They were trying to appease the Chinese censors. They had to tweak art here. They had to add a scene there. And I mean, I think at its best, it was embarrassing that this organization, this industry dedicated to free speech and art would do that just to make a few extra dollars. But listen, the dollar signs were huge. I get that. They put a lot of money into their work. So it was to them, it was necessary. But what's happened in the last year or two is that Chinese filmmakers and studios have upped their game. They can make studio-like blockbusters that rival ours as far as the look and the sounds and the sensibilities. And now the Chinese audiences are saying, yeah, we'd rather watch our stuff. And so the money from the US films has been dramatically declining. So as I often quip, I think Hollywood sold its soul for a bag of beans, because now they don't have the revenue that you once did. So what happens next? So I don't know. I know China and TikTok is an issue. I'm not an expert in there, so I don't want to dig too deep into that arena. But yeah, it was sad to see what U.S. filmmakers would do and say and censor to kind of get into a market. You think they would be too proud, too tough, too brave, too resilient to resist that, but they weren't. They just went along with it.
And Christian, is that ultimately what needs to happen here? I mean, is it that they need to lose so much money on this parallel economy, on the Chinese viewers who are not viewing their movies anymore, before they realize it doesn't really matter how I want to vote or want people to vote? If I'm going to lose my shirt over making the next blockbuster that doesn't sell any movie tickets. We just can't keep this up forever. Or are they really prepared to take this thing into the grave? I mean, it sounds crazy to say that, but
Yeah.
when we looked across the economy and seen how a lot of big companies view right of center Americans with just the most loathing and contempt, you do wonder what matters more, the profit shares, for your company, or the woke identity politics message. What do you think?
I used to say that it was show business with an asterisk because they would do things that didn't make sense economically. They'd push certain programs or certain titles that they knew and we all knew just weren't going to make a lot of money, but they wanted to get that message into the cultural bloodstream. I think that's changing a bit. I think what's happening now is that the economy is terrible. I think the streaming landscape is really not proven to be as economically viable as they thought. And I think there's real fear there. The industry in Hollywood is contracting. There's lots of stuff going on. The threat of AI is always looming. And I think they're being hammered by YouTube creators who make great stuff and podcasts and all these different outside forces. When I go to bed, I rarely watch TV. I might watch something on YouTube, a cooking channel or a podcaster who I like, or some comedians. I'm not watching The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. So I think for all those reasons, Hollywood is starting to wake up and say, we're in trouble. So I think the economic model there is starting to pinch them. And if you look at this summer's big films, they were pretty apolitical. They weren't really dabbling in the culture war. They didn't really insult us. Inside Out 2 and Bad Boys Ride or Die. A lot of films back to back that were very successful, Deadpool and Wolverine, that just didn't go there. And I think this was maybe a turning point where they said, hey, we didn't go there. We didn't make this a culture war. We weren't lecturing people. And look at the money coming in from these movies. It's outstanding. So I think that's a lesson. I think on some level, they must look at the success of Gutfeld. They must look at the success of Am I Racist? And wonder, why can't we do that too? Why couldn't we have that profit in our ledger? So, I think these things are changing a little bit, but I do think there also are diehards. I think there are people who will go down with the ship and say, we need to send a message and see where that takes us. And, maybe often it's the people who are economically secure. I talked to Jack Black a few years ago about him supporting, I think it was then Barack Obama's Iran deal. And I asked him in a very casual, friendly way, do you think about that? Do you worry about that? Ruining your brand, hurting your message, people not going to your movies? And he said, I don't really care. And it was an honest answer. Because maybe at that time he had all the money he needed and he just wanted to do what he wanted to do to push the political message that he found appropriate. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's honest. He's doing what he wants to do. But there is a price to be paid in these situations. And if you really do anger the American public, they will respond to you in a negative way. I always look at Ryan Reynolds, who I think is probably left of center. And I think he maybe made a political comment or two over the years, but he really is a let's put on a show kind of performer. He really cares about being entertaining and fun and irreverent and silly and humorous. And I think he's massively successful in part because he gets it. He's a marketer as much as he is an actor, and he's quite good at both.
Fascinating. Well, Christian, where can people follow your work and learn more?
Well, my podcast is the Hollywood in Toto podcast. It comes out each week. I also have a series of shorts. I call them Short on Hollywood. It's kind of like a little Hollywood news update with a bit of irreverence kind of baked into the cake. And of course, my website is hollywoodintoto.com.
Well, Christian Toto, thank you really for this time. It's been very eye-opening. We really appreciate you coming on the show today.
Oh, my pleasure.
And let me thank you, folks, for tuning in and supporting conservative voices like Christians working to expose the truth about the rot spreading through this once great country. Remember that it's only by working together and by praying together that we can restore the United States of America to greatness under Almighty and Sovereign God. I'm Hayden Ludwig. Join us next time as the battle rages on.
First Right, a new kind of news summary without the liberal slant. Every morning, in your inbox, always free. Subscribe by texting First Right to 30161. That's First Right, all caps, one word, to 30161.